Take your hands off her, or you'll leave this room in a box." The music stopped. The high society guests of Seoul froze as Jaejoon, the man who hadn't looked Susan's way in 5 years, pressed a cold, gold-plated barrel against a young doctor's throat. His eyes, once warm with high school memories, were now the void of a man who ruled the city's underworld. Susan was no longer the girl he ignored. She was the only thing he had ever truly owned. If you crave stories of dark devotion, possessive alphas, and the thin line between protection and obsession, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and keep watching to see how far a monster will go to reclaim his queen. The grand ballroom of the Seoul was a cathedral of glass and ego. Crystal chandeliers, heavy enough to crush a man, hung from the gold-leafed ceilings, casting a shimmering, artificial glow over the city's elite. For Susan, the daughter of the nation's most celebrated neurosurgeons, this room was a familiar stage. She had been raised in the quiet, sterile corridors of high society, a world where the scent of expensive antiseptic and Joe Malone candles masked the rot of unspoken scandals. Tonight she was a vision in emerald silk. The fabric clung to her curves, a stark, beautiful contrast to her deep, obsidian skin. Every eye in the room followed her, but Susan felt invisible. She moved with a grace that felt more like a defensive posture, her mind drifting to a memory from 5 years ago, the scent of rain and the sound of a boy's laughter in a high school hallway. That boy was Jaejoon, and he was the reason the air suddenly felt thin. When the doors opened, the room fell into a suffocating silence. It wasn't the silence of respect, it was the silence of survival. Jaejoon didn't walk, he stalked. He was a pillar of shadow in a room full of light. His tailored charcoal suit looked like armor, and his eyes, once warm and teasing, were now hollow voids that saw everything and valued nothing. He was the most feared man in Seoul, the heir to an empire built on blood and silence. He passed Susan as if she were a ghost, not a glance, not a flicker of recognition. He ignored her with a precision that was more painful than a slap. Susan stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had spent years wondering if he remembered her. Tonight she had her answer, or so she thought. Beside Susan, Dr. Min-ho noticed her trembling. Min-ho was a rising star in her father's department, handsome, pedigreed, and utterly oblivious to the monster in the room. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and confidence. "He looks like he's attending a funeral," Min-ho whispered, nodding toward Jaejoon. "A bit much for an anniversary party, don't you think?" Susan didn't answer. She couldn't breathe. Min-ho, misinterpreting her silence as shyness, slid a hand down her back, letting it rest firmly on the small of her spine. It was a gesture of ownership, a public claim. "Don't let him intimidate you, Susan. You're with me." The shift in the room was instantaneous. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. Across the floor, Jaejoon's glass shattered in his hand. Shards of crystal bit into his palm, but he didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the blood dripping onto the white marble. He began to walk. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Jaejoon stopped inches from Min-ho. He was taller, broader, and radiated a primal energy that made the doctor's refined stature look pathetic. "You save lives with those hands, doctor." Jaejoon's voice was a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to echo in the marrow of Susan's bones. "Precision is your greatest asset. It would be a tragedy to see it taken from you." Jaejoon's hand moved faster than the eye could follow, a gold-plated barrel pressing firmly under Min-ho's chin. "Take your hands off her," Jaejoon commanded, his eyes finally locking onto Susan's for the first time in 5 years. They weren't cold anymore. They were burning. "She
Take
is
your
not
hands
yours
off
to
her. She is
touch.
not yours
She
to
is not
touch.
yours to
She's
look
not
at.
yours to look
She is
at.
the air I breathe, and you are suffocating me." The exit was a blur of chaos. Guards in black suits swarmed the ballroom, creating a human wall as Jaejoon dragged Susan toward the underground valet. He didn't use a gentle hand. His grip on her wrist was iron, a physical manifestation of the 5 years of restraint that had just snapped. He threw her into the back of a black, armored sedan. The door slammed with a heavy, pressurized thud. As the engine roared to life, Susan found her voice.
You
"You're
ignored me for
insane,"
5
she
years!
screamed, lunging for the door handle. "You can't just take me. You ignored me. You treated me like I didn't exist for 5 years." Jaejoon accelerated, the tires screaming against the asphalt as they tore out into the rainy neon streets of Seoul. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I stayed away to keep you clean, Susan," he growled, his voice thick with a jagged, desperate honesty. "I watched you from the shadows. I knew every grade you got, every coffee you drank, every man who dared to smile at you. I lived in the dark so you could stay in the light. But tonight you let him touch you. You let him think he had a chance." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes dark with a terrifying possessiveness. "The boy who loved you is dead. You're dealing with the man who survived." They arrived at a penthouse that seemed to touch the clouds. It was a minimalist fortress of marble, obsidian, and glass, overlooking the Han River. Jaejoon led her inside, his shadow looming large over the expensive, cold furniture. Susan stood in the center of the room, her emerald dress torn at the shoulder, her heart still racing. "Why now, Jaejoon? Why break the silence now?" Jaejoon walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped so close she could smell the scent of wood smoke and expensive cologne. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that was more frightening than his rage. "Because I realized that being without you was killing me faster than my enemies ever could," he whispered. He walked her backward until her legs hit the edge of the oversized leather sofa. He leaned over her, his hands pinning her wrists to the cushions. "You look around this room and see a cage. Look closer, Susan. You'll see a temple. I've been building this for you since the day I left. Every brick, every guard, every drop of blood I spilled. It was all to ensure that when I finally claimed you, no one in this world could take you back." The peace of the penthouse was shattered at 3, and the heavy steel doors opened, and a man stepped in who looked like a decayed version of Jaejoon. This was Chairman Kang, Jaejoon's uncle and the man who held the leash of the Seoul underworld. He looked at Susan with a chilling, clinical detachment.
So this is the
"So
girl
this
you
is the
risked
girl
the
you risked the
syndicate for?
syndicate for," the chairman mused, his voice like dry parchment. "A doctor's daughter, a beautiful, fragile little bird." He turned to Jaejoon, his eyes narrowing. "By claiming her publicly, you've made her a target. Every rival we have now knows your heart beats outside your chest. They won't kill you, Jaejoon. They'll kill her slowly just to watch you crumble." Jaejoon stepped in front of Susan, his body a living shield. "Let them try," he said, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "I didn't bring her here to hide her. I brought her here to show the world that the Queen has arrived, and anyone who touches her will find out exactly how I earned my throne." The chairman laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Then the war begins tonight. I hope she's worth the blood, nephew." The morning sun over the Han River was cold and indifferent, bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. Jaejoon had left before dawn, leaving Susan alone with the hum of the central air and the silent, suit-clad guards stationed outside her door like gargoyles. Restless, Susan began to pace the expansive living area. Every piece of furniture felt like it belonged in a gallery, expensive, untouchable, and sterile. But near the back of the hallway, she noticed a heavy mahogany door that remained slightly ajar. She pushed it open, expecting a home office or a gym. Instead, she stepped into a time capsule. The walls were not covered in maps or ledgers, but in her. There were sketches pinned to boards, charcoal drawings of her laughing in the high school cafeteria, a profile view of her studying in the library, a quick gesture drawing of her walking home in the rain. On a central pedestal sat a glass case containing a dried, pressed corsage, the one she had worn to a dance he never took her to. Susan's breath hitched. This wasn't just a room, it was a shrine. Jaejoon hadn't spent 5 years forgetting her. He had spent 5 years obsessing over every mundane detail of her life. He had curated her existence from afar, a silent shadow participating in her life without her consent. She realized with a jolt of terror and electricity that she wasn't just his guest, she was his ultimate collection. Susan collapsed into a chair in the center of the shrine, her mind spiraling back to the night everything changed. 5 years ago, the rain had been so heavy it felt like the sky was collapsing on Seoul. She remembered sitting at her desk, the light of her lamp the only warmth in the room, when a soft thud sounded against her window. She had opened it to find Jaejoon, but he wasn't the boy who teased her about her chemistry notes anymore. He was drenched, his white school shirt translucent and stained with a terrifying, deep crimson. "Jaejoon," she had whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Don't," he had rasped, flinching away from her touch. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown with a mixture of shock and a newfound, jagged darkness. He had just watched his father breathe his last on a warehouse floor, and he had used his own teenage hands to squeeze the life out of the man who did it. "Forget me, Susan," he had said, his voice breaking. "I'm not going where you're going, I'm going into the dirt." He had disappeared into the rain that night, and Susan had spent 5 years grieving a boy who was still breathing. She realized now that the death he spoke of wasn't his body, it was his soul. The sound of the front door heavy locking brought Susan back to the present. Jaejoon walked in, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and fresh bruises. He smelled of cold air and metallic ozone. "You're awake," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion she had seen in the shrine. "Where is Min-ho?" Susan demanded, standing her ground. "My father is calling me. The hospital is in an uproar. You can't just erase people, Jaejoon." Jaejoon walked toward the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water with steady hands. "Min-ho has been persuaded to take a long-term sabbatical in Europe. His family's debts have been cleared, and his career remains intact as long as he never utters your name again." He turned to her, his gaze heavy. "You think I'm the villain because I took you. You don't see the dozen men I've killed this morning who wanted to take you for much worse reasons. In your world, protection is a phone call to the police. In my world, protection is a pile of bodies that no one ever finds." A knock at the door preceded a young man carrying a garment bag. He bowed low to Jaejoon, never making eye contact with Susan, and left the bag on the sofa. Jaejoon unzipped it, revealing a gown of crimson silk. It was beautiful, but it looked like a spill of blood against the white leather. "My uncle is hosting a summit tonight," Jaejoon explained, his fingers tracing the fine fabric. "The heads of the 5 major syndicates will be there. They believe I've grown soft because of you. They think you are a hole in my armor." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You will wear this. You will sit by my side. You will not speak, you will not flinch, and you will not look at anyone but me. Tonight we aren't just attending a meeting. We are showing them that you aren't my weakness, you are my motivation." Susan looked at the dress, feeling the weight of the silk. It wasn't a gift. It was a uniform. She was being drafted into a war she didn't understand, wearing the colors of a man she no longer recognized. The hours leading up to the summit were a lesson in survival. Jaejoon didn't hire a stylist. He handled Susan himself. He watched as she put on the dress, his eyes tracking the way the silk moved over her skin with an intensity that made her flush. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the vanity. He took a small ceramic blade from his pocket, black, non-metallic, invisible to scanners. He knelt beside her, lifting the hem of the red gown to reveal her thigh. Susan gasped, her hand flying to his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He strapped a small, lace-trimmed holster to her skin and tucked the blade inside. "If we are separated," he whispered, his face inches from hers, "do not hesitate. Aim for the femoral artery or the throat. Do not think of them as men. Think of them as obstacles between you and me." He stood up, adjusting his tie in the mirror. For a moment, the high school boy flickered in his reflection, the way he used to check his hair before talking to her. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold mask of the lieutenant. Tonight, Susan, the girl who wanted to be a doctor, stays in this penthouse. The woman who belongs to the most dangerous man in Seoul goes to the ball. Learn to lie with your eyes, or we both die before midnight. The rain over Seoul had turned into a relentless deluge, drumming against the roof of the armored SUV like 1,000 frantic heartbeats. Jaejoon had decided the penthouse was compromised. His uncle's warning wasn't just a threat, it was a countdown. They moved through the city not by the main arteries, but through a labyrinth of private tunnels and industrial service roads that only the family knew existed. The safe house was tucked beneath an abandoned textile factory on the edge of the Han River. It was a brutalist structure of poured concrete and reinforced steel, hidden behind a facade of urban decay. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of damp stone and diesel. Jaejoon's men moved with silent, military precision, their weapons held at low ready. Susan felt the weight of the red silk gown dragging on the dusty floor, a symbol of her old life being pulled through the dirt. "Stay in the center of the room," Jaejoon barked, his eyes never leaving the security monitors that flickered with grainy feeds of the perimeter. He was a different man here, the alpha in his natural habitat. The boy who loved her was buried under layers of tactical instinct and cold command. He wasn't just a man protecting a woman. He was a king guarding his most precious and most dangerous asset. Hours turned into a blur of shadows and the hum of a backup generator. Susan sat on a crate, her hands clasped in her lap to hide their shaking. On a small television in the corner, a local news report flickered to life. The headline made her breath hitch. "Elite clinic vandalized, famous surgeons targeted in gang violence." Images of her father's clinic, the place where she had spent her childhood summers, flashed on the screen. The windows were shattered, and red paint had been sprayed across the pristine white walls. Her parents were being ushered into a police car, their faces etched with a terror Susan had never seen. "You did this," she whispered, her voice cracking the silence of the bunker. Jaejoon stopped his packing. He didn't look at the TV. "I didn't order that hit, Susan. My rivals did. They want to smoke me out. They know that to hurt me, they have to hurt the things you love." "Then let me go," she screamed, standing up, the red silk shimmering in the dim light. "If I'm not with you, they'll leave them alone." Jaejoon moved across the room in a flash, his hands gripping her shoulders. "You think they're rational. You think this is a game. If you walk out that door, you're not a doctor's daughter anymore. You're a bargaining chip. They will use you to break me, and then they will discard you. Your parents are alive because my men are currently standing guard at that police station. You are the only thing keeping them breathing." The peace of the safe house was shattered by the muffled thud-thud of suppressed gunfire. The monitors went static. "Down, get down," Jaejoon yelled, shoving Susan behind a concrete pillar just as the heavy steel door was blown off its hinges. The room erupted into chaos, flashes of light and the deafening roar of close-quarters combat. Susan pressed her back against the cold concrete, her eyes wide with a primal fear. Through the smoke, she saw a figure moving toward her. It wasn't one of Jaejoon's men. He wore a tactical mask and held a serrated blade. He lunged. Susan's mind went blank, replaced by the mechanical memory of Jaejoon's training, femoral artery or throat. She reached into her gown, her fingers finding the hilt of the ceramic blade strapped to her thigh. As the man reached for her hair, she drove the blade upward with a scream. It sank into his neck with sickening ease. Hot, metallic-smelling blood sprayed across her face and the emerald silk of her dress. The man gasped, his eyes rolling back as he slumped to the floor. Susan stared at her hands, the red staining her skin. Jaejoon appeared through the smoke, his gun smoking. He looked at the body, then at Susan. He didn't offer comfort. He simply reached out and wiped a streak of blood from her forehead. "Now," he said, his voice a low, terrifying hum of pride, "now you understand what it takes to survive me." As Susan finishes stitching his shoulder, the clinical silence of the bunker snaps. Jaejoon's hand shoots out, pinning her wrists to his chest. His eyes are dark, predatory, and starved. "You shouldn't have come back for me," he growls, but his actions say the opposite. He hauls her onto the metal table, his mouth crashing against hers with a desperation that tastes of salt and iron. His large, calloused hands slide up her thighs, bunching the fabric of her dress until there's nothing between them but heat. Susan arches into him, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer as his lips move to the sensitive curve of her neck, marking her skin with a possessiveness that screams she is his. In the dim light, the quiet girl vanishes, replaced by a woman demanding every inch of the man who tried to push her away. The Council of Kings was held in a location that felt like the heart of a dead god, the sub-basement of a theater that had been closed since the 1950s. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and old, rotting velvet. Jaejoon led Susan into the room. He didn't hold her hand, he walked slightly ahead of her, the silent commander. He had instructed her to be a statue. "Do not show them your heart," he had warned. "They will try to find a crack in your armor. Give them nothing." As they sat at the long, mahogany table, the 5 leaders of the Seoul underworld watched them. Chairman Kang sat at the head, his eyes like those of a vulture. "So," one of the bosses sneered, exhaling a cloud of blue smoke. "The ghost has a shadow. Is she worth the blood spilled tonight, Jaejoon? Or is she just a distraction before we take your territory?" Jaejoon leaned back, his hand resting casually on the table, inches from Susan's. He didn't look at the boss. He looked at Susan, his eyes conveying a silent, desperate command. "Trust me." Then he did the unthinkable. He leaned over and kissed her, not a lover's kiss, but a cold, possessive marking. It was a Judas kiss, a signal to the room that she was his property, his obsession, and his ultimate weapon. When he pulled away, he looked at the council.
She isn't a distraction. She is the reason I am going to take everything you own. Now, shall we talk about the price of your survival?
"She is the reason I'm going to take everything you own. Now, shall we talk about the price of your survival?" The air in the council chamber was a physical weight, thick with the smell of old money and fresh gunpowder. Jaejoon sat at the center of the mahogany table, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were those of a man watching a ticking bomb. Susan sat on his right, a silent, crimson-clad specter. She felt the eyes of the 5 kings on her, dissecting her, looking for the girl who used to cry over failed chemistry labs. The game tonight wasn't played with cards. It was played with city blocks, shipping lanes, and human lives. Maps of Seoul were spread across the table, marked with the territories of the syndicates. "You're overextending, Jaejoon," a rival boss named Park spat, sliding a stack of black chips forward. "You've spent more on security for this, doctor, than you have on your own borders. Your men are restless. They see a king who is distracted by a pretty face." Jaejoon didn't flinch. He leaned back, pulling Susan toward him until she was forced to lean against his chest. The heat radiating from him was the only thing keeping her from shivering. He reached out, his fingers tracing the rim of his crystal glass. "My men aren't restless, Park. They're fed. And they're loyal because they know that if I can protect one woman from the entire city, I can protect them from you." He looked at Susan, a challenge in his eyes. "Tell them, Susan, what did you see at the safe house?" Susan felt the room's focus shift to her. She remembered the man she had killed, the way the blood felt like hot oil on her skin. She didn't look away. "I saw a man who died because he underestimated the person in front of him," she said, her voice steady and cold. "Just like you're doing now." The silence that followed was deafening. Jaejoon's grip on her waist tightened, a silent, possessive approval that sent a jolt through her core. He had won the round without firing a single shot. During a recess in the negotiations, Susan stepped out into the shadowed hallway to catch her breath. The adrenaline was fatting, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. She leaned against the cold stone wall, her eyes closed, trying to find the girl she used to be. "It's a long way down from the ivory tower, Isn't it, Doctor? She snapped her eyes open. It was Boss Park. He was standing too close, his breath smelling of expensive gin and decay. He reached out, his hand moving toward her face. Jaejoon is a dog who found a diamond, but even diamonds can be cut. Before his fingers could touch her skin, the shadows behind him seemed to coalesce into a solid form. Jaejoon appeared like a vengeful god. He didn't yell. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed Park by the back of the neck and slammed his face into the stone wall with a sickening crack. Park groaned, blood spraying against the velvet wallpaper, but Jaejoon wasn't finished. He spun the man around and pinned him to the floor, his knee crushing Park's chest. Jaejoon pulled the small, black ceramic blade from Susan's garter in one fluid motion. "I told you," Jaejoon whispered, his voice a terrifying melodic hum. "I told you she was the air I breathe." He didn't kill him. Instead, he made a single, precise incision across the man's lower jaw. "Next time you use that tongue to speak her name, I'll pull it out of your throat." He stood up, wiping the blade on Park's silk tie, and handed it back to Susan. His eyes were wild, consumed by an obsession that had finally broken its leash. "Back inside," he commanded. "We're finished here." The adrenaline from the council meeting hasn't faded. It has curdled into a fever. The moment the door to the bedroom slams shut, Jaejoon has her pressed against the wood. "They were looking at you like you were for the taking," he snarls against her ear, his breath hitching. He strips her with a frantic, rough efficiency, his eyes devouring the sight of her body under the moonlight. He takes her with a primal intensity that leaves no room for doubt. It's a battle of dominance and surrender. His movements are heavy and rhythmic, a silent reclamation of every year he spent pretending he didn't want her. Susan meets his pace, her nails digging into the hard muscles of his back, anchoring herself to the only man who has ever truly seen her. Betrayal didn't come with a roar, it came with a whisper. Hyuk, the man who had been Jaejoon's shadow for a decade, had traded his loyalty for a promise of power from the chairman. As they left the theater, the convoy was ambushed. In the chaos of smoke, grenades, and screeching tires, Hyuk grabbed Susan. "The chairman wants you alive,
The chairman
girl.
wants you alive,
Don't make
girl.
this harder than
Don't
it
make
has
it
to
harder
be."
than it has to be.
Susan didn't scream for Jaejoon. She remembered the anatomy of the human hand. As Hyuk tried to shove her into a rival vehicle, she grabbed his thumb and snapped it backward with all her strength. The crack was audible over the gunfire. Hyuk roared in pain, losing his grip. Susan didn't look back. She dived into the neon-soaked crowd of Myeongdong. The world was a blur of bright lights, street food steam, and the faces of 1,000 strangers. She ran until her lungs burned, her red dress torn and stained, a beacon of danger in the middle of a shopping district. She was being hunted, but for the first time she felt like the hunter. She knew the city, alleyways, she had grown up here, and she knew exactly where Jaejoon would look for her. The old high school playground was a skeleton of rusted metal and overgrown weeds, hidden behind a construction site. It was the only place in Seoul that didn't belong to the Mafia or the elite. It belonged to the memories of two kids who didn't know the world was going to break them. Susan sat on the rusted swing, the chains groaning under her weight. She was shivering, the cold night air biting at her exposed skin. A footstep sounded on the gravel. She didn't have to look up to know it was him. Jaejoon walked out of the shadows, his suit ruined, his face smeared with soot and blood. He looked like he had walked through hell to find her. "You found me," she said, her voice small. "I always find you," he replied, stopping a few feet away. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the mask of the boss finally shattered. His shoulders slumped, and he looked like the boy who used to walk her home. "I'm sorry, Susan. I'm sorry I brought the dark to your door." "The dark was already there, Jaejoon," she said, standing up. "You just stopped pretending it wasn't, but look at us. Look at what we've become." He walked toward her, his hands trembling as he reached for her face. "I tried to stay away. I tried to give you a life without me, but the thought of another man, the thought of you belonging to someone who didn't know how to keep you safe, it burned me alive." The moment of peace was shattered by the red dot of a laser sight dancing across Susan's chest. "Get down!" Jaejoon's voice was a primal roar. He didn't push her. He tackled her, wrapping his massive frame around her like a shield of meat and bone. A suppressed pop echoed through the playground, followed by the wet thud of a bullet hitting flesh. Jaejoon didn't groan. He didn't cry out. He pulled his weapon and fired 3 shots into the darkness of the construction site, followed by a scream from the sniper. He rolled over, pinning Susan beneath him, his breathing heavy and ragged. "Jaejoon," she whispered, her hands moving to his back. They came away hot and slick with blood. "Jaejoon, you're hit." "Doesn't matter," he gasped, his eyes focusing on hers with a terrifying intensity. "Are you okay? Did it touch you?" "No, I'm fine, but you're bleeding." He ignored his own wound, his hand gripping her chin. "Listen to me. The chairman. He's at the Seoul Central Hospital, the private wing. He thinks he's safe because he's dying anyway. He's wrong. You're going to get me there, Susan, and we're going to end this." After the surgery, the air in the safe house is thick and suffocating. Jaejoon is weak from blood loss, but his hunger for Susan is a living thing. He pulls her down onto the bed, his movements stiff but determined. "I almost lost you today," he whispers, his voice cracking. He worships her body with a slow, agonizing thoroughness, his tongue tracing the lines of her silhouette as if memorizing her. Despite his injury, he is relentless, his touch both a plea and a command. The intimacy is visceral, a messy, beautiful collision of sweat, soft gasps, and the lingering scent of antiseptic. He claims her again and again, ensuring the only thing she feels is the weight of his devotion. The smell of the private wing at Seoul Central Hospital was the smell of Susan's childhood, sterile, cold, and heavy with the scent of floor wax and silence. But tonight, it felt like a tomb. Jaejoon leaned heavily against her, his blood seeping through the makeshift bandage she'd tied around his shoulder, staining his white shirt a gruesome, spreading crimson. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his voice a ghost of its former strength. "No," Susan said, her voice dropping into a register of cold steel he'd never heard from her before. "Tonight, I'm the one with the clearance. You're the patient." She donned a discarded lab coat, the white fabric feeling like a suit of armor. She tucked the ceramic blade into her sleeve and grabbed a clipboard. With Jaejoon slumped in a wheelchair, head down to hide his face, she pushed him past the first security checkpoint. The guards, distracted by the lay tower fatigue and the familiarity of a doctor's coat, barely glanced at them. They reached the chairman's suite, a sprawling room filled with high-tech monitors and the rhythmic, mocking beep-beep of a heart rate sensor. Chairman Kang lay in the bed, looking like a shriveled husk, his eyes flickering open as they entered. "Susan," the old man wheezed, a hideous smirk touching his pale lips, "have you come to save me, or to watch the throne crumble?" Susan didn't answer. She walked to his IV line with a steady hand. She remembered her father's lectures on pharmacology, how easy it was to turn medicine into a quiet, untraceable exit. She held a syringe filled with a potent sedative. "I'm not here to save you," she whispered, leaning over him so only he could see the darkness in her eyes. "I'm here to show you that the girl you called a fragile bird just clipped your wings." She pushed the plunger. The chairman's eyes widened, his breath hitching as the paralytic took hold. He was alive, he was conscious, but he was a prisoner in his own skin. She turned to Jaejoon, who had pulled himself out of the chair, his gun leveled at the door. "He's yours," she said. It was the moment she stepped over the line. She wasn't just a doctor anymore. She was the architect of a coup. On the eve of the massacre, there are no more secrets. Jaejoon doesn't just want her body, he wants her soul. He lays her back on the silk sheets, his hands trembling as he explores her. This isn't the rough possessiveness of the previous nights. It's a slow, deep, and soul-searing union. Every thrust is a promise of a future he isn't sure he'll see. He watches her face as she peeks, his name a broken prayer on her lips. He enters her one last time, deep and steady, his eyes locked on hers, ensuring that even if he falls tomorrow, his touch is the only thing she will ever remember. It is a total, unfiltered surrender of the boss to his queen. 1 year later, the Shilla Hotel was once again hosting a gala, but the atmosphere had changed. The air didn't vibrate with the fear of the unknown. It hummed with the quiet, terrifying respect for the established order. Susan stood on the grand balcony, the Seoul skyline laid out before her like a carpet of diamonds. She wore a gown of midnight blue, her skin glowing under the moonlight. She was no longer just the daughter of surgeons. She was the head of the city's most prestigious trauma foundation, a woman who used her power to heal the very streets Jaejoon ruled. The doors behind her opened, and the rhythmic click of expensive shoes on marble announced his arrival. Jaejoon didn't look like the jagged, bleeding man from the playground. He looked like a king. His suit was impeccable, his movements fluid and predatory. The scar on his shoulder, the one Susan had stitched in the dark, was a hidden map of their survival. He stepped up behind her, his large hands settling on her waist with a possessiveness that had only deepened with time. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "They're waiting for us, Susan, the council, the politicians, everyone." Susan leaned back into his heat, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Let them wait. I remember a boy who once told me to forget him because he was going into the dirt." Jaejoon turned her around in his arms, his gaze intense enough to burn. "I was wrong. I didn't go into the dirt. I built a mountain so you could stand on top of it." A young, ambitious heir from a rival family stepped onto the balcony, hopping to make an impression on the elusive Queen of Seoul. He opened his mouth to speak, but the moment his eyes met Jaejoon's, the words died in his throat. The raw, primal obsession in Jaejoon's eyes was a warning that needed no translation. "She is mine. Touch her and the world ends." The young man bowed and retreated into the shadows. Susan smiled, a small, dangerous curve of her lips. She took Jaejoon's hand, her fingers interlacing with his. "Shall we go in, Chairman?" she asked. Jaejoon led her toward the ballroom, the crowd parting like water before them. "After you, my queen." The boy who ignored her was a memory. The man who owned her was a reality. And together, they were the most beautiful nightmare Seoul had ever seen. Jaejoon spent years in the dark to keep Susan in the light, only to realize they belonged together in the gray. But their story is far from over, and neither is our journey into the world of dark romance and unbreakable bonds. Now I want to hear from you. Was it the high-stakes confrontation at the anniversary party that hooked you? Did you love the slow-burn tension of their years apart? Or was it the moment Susan finally embraced her role as the Mafia queen? Drop a comment below and let me know which part of Jaejoon and Susan's story was your favorite. If you're obsessed with alpha protectors, possessive love, and stories that push the limit, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe. We have many more tales of dangerous devotion coming your way. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. See you in the next one.